Nobody in the audience that night came expecting to perform. By the end of the evening, every single one of them had. It was the early 1980s inside one of the large hotel showrooms that defined Las Vegas entertainment during this era, the kind of room that held somewhere between 800 and 1,200 people, arranged around tables draped in white linen, with cocktails being delivered quietly by staff who had learned to move without drawing attention during a performance. The lights in the house had been low since the opening act finished, and by the time Kenny Rogers walked out onto the stage, the room was exactly what a room like this was supposed to be: full, attentive, settled into the particular mood of an audience that had paid well for the evening and was ready to receive exactly what they'd come for. What that audience had come for was a Kenny Rogers show, which by this point in his career was one of the most reliable entertainments in the country. Kenny had played rooms like this many times. He knew how they worked. The way a showroom crowd was different from an arena crowd, closer and more intimate, the tables making the space feel almost like a dinner party that happened to have a stage at one end. He knew how to pace a set for this kind of room, how to let the quieter songs breathe, how to read the energy of an audience through the specific quality of their silence. The show that night had been running well. The band was tight. The first few songs had landed exactly the way they were supposed to, the opening numbers energetic enough to pull the room's attention fully into the performance, followed by the kind of mid-set sequencing that let the audience settle in, feel comfortable, start to relax into the evening rather than just watch it. By the midpoint of the set, the room had that particular quality that performers spend careers chasing: a warmth, a collective ease, the sense that everyone present was exactly where they wanted to be. Then, without any warning, the microphone went dead. Not the whole PA system. The band kept playing. The stage lights stayed up. The room didn't go dark. It was simply Kenny's microphone, which, for reasons that no one in the moment could immediately identify, stopped working. The sound cut off mid-phrase, mid-note, and for a fraction of a second the band played on without realizing anything had changed, before the awareness moved through the musicians on stage the way awareness of something wrong always does in a live performance, quickly, starting with the musicians closest to the vocal and spreading outward. The band stopped. The room went quiet. It wasn't an angry quiet or a confused quiet, though there was certainly some of both in the audience's response. It was more like the specific silence of a large group of people processing something unexpected at the same time, the slight collective intake of breath that happens when something goes wrong in a public performance, and everyone waits, without quite deciding to wait, to see what happens next. Kenny stood at the center of the stage holding a microphone that wasn't working, in front of a band that had stopped playing, in front of a room full of people who were looking at him. He didn't leave the stage. He didn't gesture for the lights to come up or for an announcement to be made or for anything that would have formally acknowledged the situation as a problem requiring a solution. He simply stood there for a moment, long enough for the silence to settle fully over the room, long enough for everyone present to understand that something had happened that nobody had planned for. And then he did something that most performers in that situation, holding a dead microphone on a Las Vegas stage, would not have done. He stayed in the song. The song he had been performing when the microphone failed was one the audience knew. They had known it from the first notes of the introduction, before he had even begun to sing. The kind of recognition that moves through a showroom crowd as a physical thing, a small collective shift in posture and attention that performers can feel even when they can't see individual faces clearly. By the time the microphone went dead, the audience had been listening to this particular song for well over a minute. They had the melody in their ears. They had the words somewhere just behind their attention, the way words to a song you've heard 100 times live in a person, not actively present, but immediately available when something calls them up. Kenny turned slightly toward the audience. Not a dramatic gesture, not the kind of wide, theatrical move that signals to a room that something deliberate is happening. Just a small shift in orientation, a slight angling of his body toward the tables in front of him. And then, without a microphone, without amplification, without anything between him and a room of 1,000 people except the distance of a stage, he began to sing. Nobody could hear him, not clearly. He was singing, and his mouth was moving. His body had the posture of someone performing, but the room was too large and his voice too unamplified for anyone past the first few rows to make out what he was doing. What they could see was that he was still in the song, that he hadn't stopped, that whatever had gone wrong with the equipment, Kenny Rogers had decided in that moment that it wasn't going to stop the song from happening. And then something shifted in the audience. It didn't start everywhere at once. It started the way most things start in a large crowd, in one small place, someone at a table near the front, close enough to see what Kenny was doing, who understood what was happening and did the only thing that seemed to make any sense. They started to sing too. Not loudly, not performatively, quietly, the way you might sing along to something playing on the radio when you don't realize you've started. And then someone at the next table. And then someone a few rows back. And then, in the particular way that collective behavior spreads through a room that's already primed to do something together, the singing moved outward from those first few voices like a wave, table by table, section by section, until the entire room was doing something that, 10 minutes earlier, not a single person in it had planned to do. They were carrying the song, all of them. 1,000 people who had paid for an evening's entertainment and were now, without anyone asking them to, providing it for each other, and for the man on stage, who stood without a working microphone in front of an audience that had decided, collectively and without discussion, that the show was going to continue regardless. Kenny let it happen. More than that, he encouraged it. He turned fully toward the audience, dropped the dead microphone to his side, and listened. He listened the way performers sometimes listen to a crowd doing something unexpected, with the particular quality of attention that comes from recognizing that something is happening that you haven't seen happen before, and that the right response is not to control it, but to let it be what it's becoming. He watched the room fill with the sound of its own singing, and he stayed in the middle of it, and he let it go on. The band, reading the room the way a good band does, eased back into the song. Not aggressively, not loudly, quietly, finding the key the audience had settled into, adding instrumentation under the singing without overwhelming it. The drummer kept a gentle rhythm. The other musicians came back in, one by one, until the song that had started as a Kenny Rogers performance was now something else, a collaboration between a professional musician on a stage and 1,000 people who had come for an evening of entertainment and had ended up, unexpectedly, making some of their own. The technical crew, working on the microphone problem from the side of the stage, had it fixed within a few minutes. A loose connection somewhere, the kind of failure that's as random as it is disruptive. When Kenny's microphone came back on, the sound of his own amplified voice joined the singing in the room, and the two, his voice and the crowd's, moved through the final portion of the song together before the audience finished, and the room erupted into the kind of applause that sounds different from ordinary applause, louder and more surprised, the sound of people clapping for something they'd just been part of, rather than something they'd just watched. Kenny stood at the microphone and said very little. There wasn't much to say that the moment hadn't already said. He thanked the audience, briefly, warmly, in exactly the tone he usually used when something had moved him and he didn't want to oversell it. And then he moved on with the show, the way performers do when something unexpected has happened that can't be replicated and would only be diminished by dwelling on it. The rest of the set proceeded normally. The songs that followed were performed the way they always were. Kenny, with a working microphone, singing for an audience that was now listening with a different quality of attention than they'd had before, closer, more invested, the way an audience becomes more invested in a performer once something has happened that pulls down the formal distance between them. What happened that night in that Las Vegas showroom wasn't something anyone could have planned. Nobody could have arranged for a microphone to fail at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right song playing, in front of exactly the right audience. It happened because technical things fail and crowds are unpredictable, and sometimes, very occasionally, those two things coincide in a way that produces something nobody expected. For the people who were in that room, sitting at those white linen tables, with cocktails they'd forgotten about, and a song they'd suddenly found themselves singing, the night became the kind of memory that gets told and retold. One of those stories people bring out years later when someone asks about the best show they ever saw. The time the microphone went out at a Kenny Rogers show in Vegas, and the whole room sang the song for him, and for a few minutes a crowd of strangers became something that's genuinely hard to put a name to. For Kenny Rogers, it became one of those nights that reminded him why a live audience was different from anything else in the business, different from a recording, different from a television appearance, different from anything that could be planned or controlled or produced. In a room with 1,000 people, things could happen that had never happened before and would never happen the same way again. A microphone could fail. A crowd could sing. A show could become something that nobody in it had come expecting to be part of. That's the thing about Las Vegas entertainment that the recordings and the photographs and the reviews never quite captured. The live part. The fact that every night was unrepeatable, that the same show in the same room with the same performer would always be different from the night before, because the audience was different, and because anything could happen, and because sometimes what happened was something that left everyone in the room, the performer, the band, the audience, even the crew, fixing a loose connection at the side of the stage, with the specific, quiet certainty that they had just been part of something that wasn't going to happen again. Nobody in that audience came expecting to perform, but by the time the song ended, every one of them had, and not one of them would have told you afterward that they'd minded at all.